for intelligence. That is, she was relying
that is
on
factually not
no,
correct.
it is absolutely
relied
factually
on
correct.
Mr. Blumenthal for most of her intelligence.
Ms. Mitchell, take a look at the email trails, and you will see.
I cover the State Department. That is just factually not correct.
That clip, for me, just defies all logic, and I think Andrea Mitchell correctly called him out on something that was a falsehood. Secretary Clinton, what did you think when you heard that clip?
Well, that it was factually untrue. And I think your questioning and what I have stated today is a much clearer and more factual description of how we gathered information to make our decisions regarding Libya.
Happened.
We're in the first quarter 2012.
For everyone or for Benghazi?
I'm sorry, yes, ma'am. Related to Benghazi and Libya, do you know how many there were?
No, I do not know.
Ma'am, there were just over 100 plus. In the second quarter, do you know how many there were?
No, I do not.
Ma'am, there were 172-ish. Might have been 171 or 173. That's how many were there in July and August, and then in that week and a few days before the attacks? Do you know?
There were a number of them. I know that.
Yes, ma'am. 83 by our count. That's over 600 requests. You've testified here this morning that you had none of those reach your desk. Is that correct also?
That's correct.
Madam Secretary, Mr. Blumenthal wrote you 150 emails. It appears from the testimony or the materials that we've read that all of those reached your desk.
Making sure the public record is complete is what serious investigations do, so it was important and remains important that this committee have access to all of Ambassador Stevens' emails, the emails of other senior leaders and witnesses, and it is important to gain access to all of your emails, Madam Secretary. Your emails are no less or no more important than the emails of anyone else. It just took us a little bit longer to get them, and it garnered a little more attention in the process. I want you to take note during this hearing how many times congressional Democrats call on this administration to make long-awaited documents available to us. They won't. Take note of how many witnesses congressional Democrats ask us to schedule for interview. They won't. We would be much closer to finding out what happened and writing the final definitive report if Democrats on this committee had helped us just a little bit pursue the facts. But if the Democrats on this committee had their way, dozens of witnesses never would have been interviewed. Your public record would still be private. Thousands of documents never would have been accessed. And we wouldn't have the emails of our own ambassador. That may be smart politics, but it is a lousy way to run a serious investigation. You had an unusual email arrangement, which meant the State Department could not produce your emails to us. You made exclusive use of personal email and a personal server. And when you left the State Department, you kept the public record to yourself for almost 2 years. And it was you and your attorneys who decided what to return and what to delete. Those decisions were your decisions, not our decisions. It was only in March of this year we learned of this email arrangement. And since we learned of this email arrangement, we have interviewed dozens of witnesses, only one of whom was solely related to your email arrangement. And that was the shortest interview of all, because that witness invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege against incrimination. Responsive to our first request?
I can't speak to it. I believe your first request was for Benghazi, and I believe that the State Department did a diligent search. Then I believe you expanded it to Libya and weapons and maybe a few other terms, and I believe they conducted
our jurisdiction hasn't grown, Madam Secretary. Our jurisdiction is the same thing it was. Let me ask you this. You say that you turned over everything. I don't get a chance to watch you a lot on television, but when I see you are interviewed, you make a point of saying, I turned over everything.
All my work-related emails.
How do you know that?
I know that because there was an exhaustive search done under the supervision of my attorneys, and that is exactly the outcome. We turned over every work-related email. In fact, as somebody referred to earlier, we turned over too many. In the State Department and the National Archives said there were 1,246 out of the 30,000 that they've already determined did not need to be turned over.
And you have a
Regular
really
order, Mr.
good group of attorneys, which makes me wonder how they missed 15 of them.
Well, if you're talking about Mr. Blumenthal, which I assume you are, he had some that I didn't have, and I had some that he didn't have, and I was under no obligation to make any of his emails available unless I decided they were work-related. And the ones that I decided that were work-related, I forwarded to the state.gov accounts of the people with whom I worked.
My question is, was it a mistake for the 4 years that you had that email arrangement? Was it a mistake almost 2 years that you kept the public record to yourself, or has it manifested itself as a mistake in just the last 6 months?
Well, since I believed that all of my work-related emails to .gov accounts were being captured and preserved, it wasn't until I was asked to help the State Department to fill in what they saw as some record-keeping gaps, not just with me, but with others. I did the best I could during those 4 years and thought that everything that I was emailing that was work-related was being preserved.
If you can find a source for the 90 to 95%, I would be grateful for it, and we would probably have fewer questions. If there is a source that you can provide that 90 to 95% were on the State Department system, then I'll know that I need to ask the State Department what took them so long. Because I'm just telling you, Madam Secretary, I got 8 emails the first time I asked, and now I've got over 1,500. So there's some disconnect there.
Well, Mr.
State Department. He didn't work for the U.S. government at all. He wanted to work for the State Department, but the White House said no to him. Do you recall who specifically at the White House rejected Sidney Blumenthal?
No, I do not.
After he was turned down for a job at the State Department by the White House, he went to work where?
I think he had a number of consulting contracts with different entities.
Well, if he had a number of them, do you recall any of them?
I know that he did some work for my husband.
Well, he worked for the Clinton Foundation.
That's correct.
Okay. He worked for Media Matters.
I'm sure he did.
He worked for Correct the Record.
I'm sure he did.
When you were asked about Sidney Blumenthal, you said he was an old friend who sent you unsolicited emails, which you passed on in some instances because you wanted to hear from people outside what you called the bubble. We will ignore for a second whether or not Sidney Blumenthal is outside the bubble, but I do want to ask you about a couple of those other comments, because what you left out was that he was an old friend who knew absolutely nothing about Libya, was critical of President Obama and others that you work with, loved to send you political and image advice, had business interests in Libya, which he not only alerted you to, but solicited your help for. And you often forwarded his emails, but usually only after you redacted out any identifiers so nobody knew where the information was coming from. What does the word unsolicited mean to you?
It means that I did not ask him to send me the information that he sent me, and as I have previously stated, some of it I found interesting, some of it I did not, some of it I forwarded, some of it I did not. I did not know anything about any business interests. I thought that, just as I said previously, newspaper articles, journalists, of which he is one, a former journalist, had some interesting insights. And so we took them on board and evaluated them, and some were helpful and others were not.
We're going to get to all the points you just made, but I want to start with your public comment that these emails were unsolicited. You wrote to him, "Another keeper, thanks and please keep them coming. Greetings from Kabul and thanks for keeping this stuff coming. Any other info about it? Question mark. What are you hearing now? Question mark. Got it. We'll follow up tomorrow. Anything else to convey? Question mark." Now that one is interesting because that was the very email where Mr. Blumenthal was asking you to intervene on behalf of a business deal that he was pursuing in Libya. What did you mean by what are you hearing now?
I have no idea, Congressman. They started out unsolicited, and as I said, some were of interest. I passed them on, and some were not. And so he continued to provide me information that was made available to him.
I don't want to parse words, and I don't want to be hyper-technical, because it's not a huge point, but it is an important point. You didn't say they started off unsolicited. You said
they did.
You said they were unsolicited.
Well, they were unsolicited, but obviously I did respond to some of them.
Well,
and I'm sure that encouraged him.
Anything else to convey? What are you hearing now? I'm going to Paris tomorrow night. We'll meet with TNC leaders, so this and additional info useful. Still don't have electricity or BlackBerry coverage post-Irene, so I've had to resort to my new iPad. Let me know if you received this. We'll talk about the new iPad in a little bit. Here's another one. This report is in part a response to your questions. That's an email from him to you. This report is in part a response to your questions. There'll be further information in the next day. If you're the one asking him for information, how does that square with the definition of unsolicited?
I said it began that way, Mr. Chairman, and I will add that both Chris Stevens and Gene Kretz found some of the information interesting, far more than I could, because they knew some of the characters who were being mentioned, and they were the ones, the kind of persons with the expertise that I asked to evaluate to see whether there was any useful information.
We're going to get to that in a second. Now, before you give Mr. Blumenthal too much credit, you agree he didn't write a single one of those cables or memos he sent you.
I'm sorry, what?
He didn't write a single one of those cables or memos.
I don't know who wrote them. He's the one who sent them to me.
Would you be surprised to know not a single one of those was from him?
I don't know where he got the information that he was sending to me.
Did you ask? You're sending me very specific, detailed intelligence. What is your source? That seems to me like a pretty good question.
I did learn later that he was talking to or sharing information from former American intelligence officials.
By the name of? Who wrote those cables?
I don't recall. I don't know, Mr. Chairman.
You had his information passed on to others, but at least on one occasion you asked Ms. Abedine, can you print without any identifiers? Why would you want his name removed?
Because I thought that it would be more important to just look at the substance and to make a determination as to whether or not there was anything to it.
Well, don't people have a right to know the source of the information so they can determine credibility?
But he wasn't, as you just said, the source of the information. But
you didn't know that, Madam Secretary, and that's what you just said.
No, Mr. Chairman. I said that I knew that he didn't have the sources to provide that information. I knew he was getting it from somewhere else. Whether he knew a lot of journalists, he knew others in Washington. It could have been a variety of people.
Well, if you're going to determine credibility, don't you want to know the source?
Well, it wasn't credibility so much as trying to follow the threads that were mentioned about individuals. And as I already stated, some of it was useful and some of it was not.
Well, did the president know that Mr. Blumenthal was advising you?
He wasn't advising me. And, you know,
Did he
Mr.
know
Chairman,
that he was your most prolific emailer that we have found on the subjects of Libya and Benghazi?
that's because I didn't do most of my work
That's
about
fair.
Libya on
I'm
email.
not challenging that, Madam Secretary. I am not challenging that. All I'm telling you is the documents show he was your most prolific emailer on Libya and Benghazi. And my question to you is, did the president, the same White House that said you can't handle him, can't hire him, did he know that he was advising you?
He was not advising me, and I have no reason to have ever mentioned that or know that the president knew that.
All right, I want to draw your attention to an email about Libya from Mr. Blumenthal to you, dated April 2011. It will be Exhibit 67. And this is informative. Should we pass on, and in parentheticals, unidentified to the White House? If you were going to pass something on to the White House, why would you take off the identifiers?
Because it was important to evaluate the information, and from a lot of intelligence that I have certainly reviewed over the years, you often don't have the source of the intelligence. You look at the intelligence and you try to determine whether or not it is credible, whether it can be followed up on.
Well, I'm going to accept the fact that you and I come from different backgrounds, because I can tell you that an unsourced comment could never be uttered in any courtroom. You have
We're
to
not
have the
talking about
right.
courtrooms, Mr.
No,
Chairman.
no.
We're talking about intelligence.
No, we're
and-
talking about credibility and the
Well-
ability to assess who a source is.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, in your opening comments, you said this was an unusual case. I would say that's the understatement of the year. Husband of the subject meets with the Attorney General 3 days before Secretary Clinton is interviewed by the FBI. 9 people get to sit in with Secretary Clinton during that interview. One of those was her Chief of Staff, Cheryl Mills, who was the subject of the investigation. 5 people get some kind of immunity. 5 people get some kind of immunity, yet no one is prosecuted. 3 of those people who get immunity take the 5th in front of Congress, and one of them doesn't even bother to show up when he's subpoenaed. Supposed to have been at that very chair you're sitting at. And of course, the Attorney General announces that she's going to follow your recommendations, even though she doesn't know what those recommendations are, the only time she's ever done that. So of course this was an unusual. We've never seen anything like this, which sort of brings me to the post. I'd like to put up the post that some have talked about, which is the post by Mr. Combetta on Reddit. And you said earlier that you don't know if you examined this during your investigation, so let's examine it now. I need to strip out a VIP's address from a bunch of archived email.
This committee is the first committee, the only committee, to uncover the fact that Secretary Clinton exclusively used personal email on her own personal server for official business and kept the public record, including emails about Benghazi and Libya, in her own custody and control for almost 2 years after she left office. You will hear a lot today about the Accountability Review Board. Secretary Clinton has mentioned it more than 70 times in her previous testimony before Congress. But when you hear about the ARB, you should also know the State Department leadership handpicked the members of the ARB. The ARB never interviewed Secretary Clinton. The ARB never reviewed her emails. And Secretary Clinton's top advisor was allowed to review and suggest changes to the ARB before the public ever saw it. There's no transcript of ARB interviews, so it's impossible to know whether all relevant questions were asked and answered. And because there's no transcript, it is also impossible to cite the ARB interviews with any particularity at all. That is not independent. That is not accountability. That is not a serious investigation. You made exclusive use of personal email and a personal server. And when you left the State Department, you kept the public record to yourself for almost 2 years. And it was you and your attorneys who decided what to return and what to delete. Those decisions were your decisions, not our decisions. It was only in March of this year we learned of this email arrangement. And since we learned of this email arrangement, we have interviewed dozens of witnesses, only one of whom was solely related to your email arrangement. And that was the shortest interview of all, because that witness invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege against incrimination.
Basically, they don't want the VIP's email address exposed to anyone. Now, Director, when I hear the term strip out email address, I think of somebody's trying to hide something, somebody's trying to cover up something, and it sort of raises an important question from these 2 sentences. Who's the they who wants something hid, and who's the VIP who also wants something hid? Director Comey, is it likely the VIP well, actually not just a VIP, it's a very, very important person according to Mr. Combetta. Is it likely that that person is Secretary Clinton?
Yes, sure.
Okay, and is it also likely that the they refers to her Secretary Clinton's staff and specifically Cheryl Mills?
I don't know that. Either her lawyers or some staff that had tasked him with the production.
So one other thing that's important on that, if we could put that back up, one other thing that's important is the date. The date at the top says July 24th, 2014. So whenever I see a date, I'm sure you do the same thing, I always look at what's happening about that same time frame, what may have happened directly before that, and maybe directly after that. So I went back to your reports that you guys had given to us. The first report back last month, August 18th, 2016, page 15. On page 15 it says, during the summer of 2014, State Department indicated to Cheryl Mills a request for Clinton's work-related emails would be forthcoming. State Department gives Cheryl Mills a heads up that she's got to go round up all of Secretary Clinton's email. On that same page it says the House Select Committee on Benghazi had reached an agreement with the State Department regarding production of documents on July 23rd, 2014, just the day before, which I find kind of interesting. Then from your report that we got just last week, after reviewing several documents dated in and around July 23rd, 2014, Paul Combetta had a conversation with Cheryl Mills, and after reviewing a July 24th, there's that date again, 2014 email from Brian Pagliano, Paul Combetta explained Cheryl Mills was concerned Clinton's then current email address would be disclosed publicly. So, sure looks to me like it's Secretary Clinton, as you said, but also that it's Cheryl Mills and Brian Pagliano who are urging Mr. Combetta to cover this stuff up. You agree?
From what you read, it sure sounds like they're trying to figure out a way to strip out the actual email address from what they produce.
Well, they're actually trying to strip it all out. PST file, everything. Here's the takeaway in my mind. Mills gets a heads up, Cheryl Mills gets a heads up in midsummer of 2014. July 23rd, the day before Mr. Combetta's Reddit post, the Benghazi Committee and the State Department reach an agreement on production of documents. Cheryl Mills has a conversation with Paul Combetta. He goes on Reddit then and tries to figure out how he can get rid of all this email. Even though he's not successful then, he has to do it later down the road with BleachBit. And then the clincher. The clincher. Just last week, he's going online and trying to delete these Reddit posts. He's trying to cover up his tracks. He's trying to cover up the cover-up. So I guess the question is, and someone's asked it earlier, in light of all this, are you thinking about reopening the investigation?
I may have misunderstood what you said during the question. I don't understand that to be talking about deleting the emails. I understand to be talking about removing from the from line the actual email address. But anyhow, maybe I misunderstood you. But
the same guy later took BleachBit and did delete emails.
Sure. Yeah.
So my question is, the guy you gave immunity to, the guy who took the fifth in front of us, is online trying to figure out how to remove email addresses, change evidence, later uses BleachBit. That guy, who won't testify in front of Congress, and he has correspondence with Cheryl Mills. Cheryl Mills, a subject of the investigation. Cheryl Mills, who also got some kind of immunity agreement. Cheryl Mills, who walked out for part of the questions during the interview with the FBI. Seems to me that's pretty compelling, and the timeline's pretty compelling as well.
I'm not following compelling of what. There's no doubt that Combetta was involved in deleting emails.
After conversations with Cheryl Mills.
He had the OSHIT moment, as he told us. And that's why it was very important for us to interview this guy to find out who told you to do that, why did you do that. That's why he was given use of it.
Did you know about the Reddit post when you interviewed him?
As I said earlier, I think we did. I think our investigators did. I'm not positive as I sit here.
Mr. Chairman, the guy's trying to cover up the Reddit post where he's trying to figure out how he can cover up the email addresses. And I find that compelling, particularly in light of the fact that just the day before, he's talking with Cheryl Mills, and the State Department is on notice that the Benghazi Committee wants these very documents. I find that compelling, but obviously the FBI didn't, and this is just one more in that list of things that make this case highly unusual. I yield back.
The director is permitted to respond if he chooses to do so.
No, I don't think so.
From California, Mr. Issa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, I've got a lot of concerns, but one of them refers to Reddit. At the time that the Department of Justice, at your behest or your involvement, gave Paul Combetta immunity, did you do so knowing about all of the posts he had on Reddit and capturing all of those posts and correspondence where he was asking how to wipe or completely erase on behalf of a VVIP, so to speak?
I'm not sure sitting here. My recollection is, and I'll check this and fix it if I'm wrong, that we had some awareness of the Reddit posts. I don't know whether our folks had read them all or not. We had a pretty good understanding of what we thought he had done, but that's my best recollection.
Okay. In the last week, en masse, he's been deleting them from Reddit posts. Is that consistent with preserving evidence? And I say that because there's still an ongoing interest by Congress, and only in spite of Reddit's own senior, what they call flak team, trying to hide it, only because a few people caught it, do we even know about it, and is this and other committees interested in getting the backups that may exist on these deletions? I guess my question to you is he destroying evidence relevant to congressional inquiries? And I'll answer it for you, yes, he is. And what are you going to do about it?
That's not something I can comment on.
Well, let me go into something that concerns this body in a very specific way. As a former chairman issuing subpoenas, I issued a subpoena, and additionally, I issued preserved letters. In addition to that, now Chairman Chaffetz issued what were effectively preserved letters. Some of them were directly to Hillary Rodham Clinton while she was still secretary. Others, the subpoena in 2013 was to Secretary Kerry. These individuals destroyed documents pursuant or took it out of federal custody pursuant to our subpoena and our discovery. As a result, they committed crimes. My question to you is, when I was a chairman and I wanted to grant immunity to somebody, I had to go notice the Department of Justice, and you were consulted. Isn't that correct?
In a particular matter?
In any matter.
I don't know whether the FBI is consulted in that circumstance.
Okay, for the record, yes, the Department of Justice does not grant immunity without checking with federal law enforcement to see whether it will impact any ongoing investigation. That's the reason we have a requirement to give notice. When the reverse was occurring, you were handing out like candy, according to some, immunity. Did you, or to your knowledge, Department of Justice, confer with Chairman Goodlatte, Chairman Chaffetz, Chairman Smith, or any of the other chairmen who had ongoing subpoenas and investigations?
Not to my knowledge.
So isn't there a double standard that when you granted immunity to these 5 individuals, you took them out of the reach of prosecution for crimes committed related to destruction of documents or withholding or other crimes pursuant to congressional subpoenas?
I don't think anybody was given transactional immunity.
Oh, really? Now, we have not allowed to make your immunities public, but I'm going to take the privilege of making one part of it public. I read them. You gave immunity from destruction to both of those attorneys, not just turning them over, the documents over, specifically destruction. You did the same thing with these other 2 individuals, Brian and Paul Cabera. You gave them immunity from destruction.
Yeah, I don't think, well, again, I could always be wrong, but I don't have them in front of me either.
Well, because you don't let us take them out of the skiff, it's a little hard for us too. But the fact is, when you read them...
My answer, I'm pretty sure that what was granted was use immunity. In the case of those 2 people, coextensive with 18 U.S.C. 6001, which means no statement you make can be used against you directly or indirectly. Transactional immunity is sometimes given also by prosecutors, says you will not be prosecuted in any event for this set of facts. I don't think there was any transactional immunity.
Well, when I read for both of the attorneys that immunity was granted, it's in both cases said destruction, in addition to the turning over. Why was that? Why would you believe that was necessary, or do you believe that would be necessary? You wanted the document, you wanted the physical evidence. Why did you have to give them immunity from destruction of materials? And because my time is expiring, when you look into it and hopefully get back to this committee, I'd like to know, does that immunity apply only to destruction on the computers delivered so that other destructions by Cheryl Mills could still be prosecuted?
Yeah, again, my recollection is no transactional immunity was given. A protection of statements was given to the Gambetta guy and Mr. Pagliano.
Thank you, Mr.